Thank you so much. I am happy to be here. Hello, everyone. Um, as I was just introduced, I am Morvareed Salehpour. I am a business and tech lawyer, and I work with entrepreneurs, startups, and founders, and help them with all their contracts and tech transactions and legal questions related to what they're doing, particularly with emerging spaces. So I work with clients, for example, in AI and analytics as among the businesses I help and assist with. So today we're going to be talking about AI and the law. And of course, AI is an area that continues to developing. It is an emerging space. And there are, of course, issues involved with AI that are unique to the space and are continuing to develop in the space because it is an area where there can often be, complex problems where there is some gray, and you have to find that appropriate balance of legal risk and business interest to really be able to kind of grow your business appropriately. So we're going to kind of go through some of the issues in the AI space and related to these complications today. So what are some of the challenges with AI? So there's a couple different areas where different challenges come into play with AI technology. So one of the considerations is social and ethical considerations. So that's an issue we're going to talk about in more detail, and it's something that we're starting to see a lot happening with more recently. There is also economic impacts associated with the adoption of artificial intelligence. Additionally, there is intellectual property considerations involved with all of this, as well as privacy implications. So AI involves a lot of data, and a lot of issues surrounding all of that is with how we treat the data and how we maintain or at least treat privacy. There's additionally issues related with, well, when you're dealing with AI and there is algorithms that are acting, how do we maintain, the responsibilities regarding around liability there? So one of the first issues is social and ethical considerations, as we discussed. So use of facial recognition software for identification purposes currently exists because so one of the issues there is that there's a high rate of error with respect to minorities and women. And this is something that we've seen repeatedly with the use of facial recognition software, but that continues to come up. And we've seen a lot of that happening because there is both implicit biases of developers that is worked into the algorithm itself, as well as biases in the data that's used. So the data that's being incorporated in all of this can involve data that has unintentionally biases incorporated in. So we think about this, for example, when you have the criminal justice system. It itself has biases built into the way that it operates. So once you're taking the data from that system and importing it into some kind of algorithm, you're taking all the biases that are built into that system to be incorporated into that algorithm. So you don't want to be into a position where you're are basically adopting that bias data and then giving it basically some kind of understanding of it not being biased just because it's an algorithm. So we need to recognize that as a source of creation of social and issues there and ethical considerations. Another kind of social and ethical consideration in this space is that there's increased autonomous weapons being created, and this can lead to a worldwide kind of autonomous weapons race. And there are particular countries like Russia that are seeking to be a leader in this space. And it creates another kind of line of division between the actual kind of harm that's coming from that and the people who are kind of committing it. So it creates a broader kind of source of harm from it. Additionally, we have increased use of misinformation through bots that's leading to social and political manipulation. So that is something that we need to continue to kind of understand and, be able to address moving forward, particularly with relation to our elections that we're seeing that these are influencing. There are also, as we discussed, economic impacts with all of this. So AI is exponentially growing in the next few decades, and we will see job loss from AI significantly outpace jobs created by artificial intelligence. And our governments aren't really prepared to deal with. So we need to, our governments need to start actually thinking about artificial intelligence and more broadly tech innovation in general. So they're not a lot of, particularly the US government is not very tech forward, and they don't actually treat a lot of technological issues up front. So we don't have a lot of legislators addressing these issues, and that makes it more difficult to actually address both the effects and technological innovation itself, right? We have certain countries like China that's become very forward on a lot of these technological issues, and with respect to, for example, digitization of payment processing, but we're not that advanced in the US yet, and we don't have mass adoption. So that's something that we need our governments to both be adopting the tech and making sure we're innovating, but also addressing what are the effects of this. And so with artificial intelligence, the issue is, how do we address the mass unemployment? And that is considering things like UBI and universal healthcare. And the interesting thing with all of this is that we're kind of seeing an effect of this right now with what's going on with COVID. So we've seen mass unemployment. So this creates a situation where we can actually make progress and be able to better prepare for what's coming with the kind of exponential growth that's expected of the fourth industrial revolution. And we can actually have opportunities to kind of explore UBI and universal healthcare now, so that we can make that transition a lot cleaner as it happens with technological innovation, so less people are negatively affected from it. We then have intellectual property considerations that go into all of this kind of AI, and that's another area of complication that is an issue. And one of these kind of, and it's different ways that the intellectual property considerations come into play with artificial intelligence. So one is, you're creating artificial intelligence platforms or services, and traditional intellectual property rights apply for companies in that space. So that means, you have to pursue intellectual property protection for whatever you're creating. That means, copywriting, trademarking, patenting what you need to copyright, trademark, or patent. Additionally, you need to have well-drafted agreements in place to protect your intellectual property in your transactions. So that means, you have appropriate agreements with your employees, your consultants, your vendors, with other parties, your strategic partners that you're using to scale your business, with your customers. You need to make sure you're appropriately protected, particularly if you are some kind of, analytics, SaaS company, something like that. You need to have very strong agreements where you're dealing with both intellectual property and data in the proper way to actually be able to protect those innovations and be able to continue to kind of scale and grow. In addition to those kind of, traditional intellectual property rights that you have to now, be a little bit innovative in some of these transactions with the way you protect them in your, relationships with, for example, your customers or with strategic partners. You additionally have to, the new realm of there's being AI that's being created, intellectual property that's being created by AI. So you have things such as AI generated music and AI generated code. And this kind of raises the question of, well, there's not like a physical kind of person or entity that's created this, this invention. So where is the ownership of this going to? And, this is, potentially some gray here, but then there is, the AI itself, right? The algorithm does belong to a certain entity. So it would make sense that the whatever that's created by that algorithm, it also belongs to the company, that's the entity, the individual that's created the algorithm. And that's what we've seen some kind of things in line with that kind of occurring already. Like there was one of these intellectual property offices, someone who had created an algorithm that had created its own kind of code, had tried to argue that the kind of the code belonged to itself, and they kind of ruled that it belonged to him. So it will not be surprising to see that kind of being the continued path forward. But I also see there being more nuances to this as the AI created inventions get more complex and further lines of kind of distance occur between the individual or the entity who created the business and the AI that's being created. So we can see situations being where there's some AI generated code that was created by another AI generated code. So you start getting change and you start getting distance between the individual and the new product. So I think those would be interesting kind of situations to see how all that can play out, particularly if results down the road are potentially a mix of different algorithms kind of working together to create a new product. So there are different potential rights mixed into there. In addition to that kind of new frontier, we have AI being used for intellectual property administration. So this is a kind of interesting idea. However, it's very complicated because intellectual property is not uniform globally. It's very jurisdictional, and intellectual property laws are very specific to the country where it's located. So it's hard to find some kind of way to automate that easily. So I think that's a thing that is very complicated, and if it's going to kind of happen, it'll likely be further down the road because it is a more difficult way to move forward. The other kind of interesting issue that may arise in the kind of intellectual property space is AI infringement issues, right? So infringement occurs when you use someone's intellectual property without their permission, or you either modify it or use the same material. Different ways that things can happen, but you're basically using someone else's intellectual property without having rights to do that. Well, when you have an algorithm operating, it's operating autonomously, and it can create a situation where it infringes where the person who owns it did not intend it. So it opens up the potential for just as ownership is passed on to the ultimate owner, potentially the liability being passed on to the ultimate entity or individual who owns the algorithm. And that's something we'll discuss liability a little bit more, but that's a whole kind of new issue that can arise. Another kind of issue related to all of this is privacy again. And this goes back to the whole data issue. So more and more data is being fed into AI platforms and algorithms, and ownership of that data is very important and involves very complicated laws. And it depends on both where you're located, where you're operating, where you're located, and where the people, your customers or the people who use data you are gathering, where they are located. So depending on the scale of your business, that could be everything. For example, if you're connected to the EU, that's the GDPR. If you're operating in California or connected in California and dealing with data from consumers who are in California, that'll involve California's Consumer Privacy Act that went into effect this January. If you're dealing with medical information, you have high-tech and HIPAA. So you have extra protections related to those. There are also additional rules if you're dealing, for example, in the financial space, or if you're even broader. So if you're dealing in additional countries like Canada, they have their own privacy laws. So that creates extra complications in how all the data is being stored and the security you have for it, what rights consumers have to that data, what rights your customer is going to want for that data, obligations and liabilities related to data breaches. So it's very important to think about all of this as you're structuring your algorithm and platform, and to think about, what scale, and this is not something you can ignore, at the beginning saying you're just a startup. These are real issues that you need to deal with. So you need to think about, well, where am I going to scale? Am I going to go global at first? Am I going to, do something more narrow first, kind of build out my product, maybe just in California, so I don't have to worry about, GDPR. I'm just going to worry about the California Consumer Privacy Act. So these are things you have to consider and that are important to any of these AI and, analytical kind of platforms, because they all involve data and the algorithms are using data. So some of the issues that come along with privacy are, there is just moving kind of, this has been the trend, and moving forward it's going to continue to be then. There's decreasing individual privacy. So AI is analyzing individuals' online behavior, and this reveals political beliefs, religious affiliation, race, ethnicity, health considerations, sexual orientation, even if they've never really, if someone hasn't, straight up like revealed that information, it's, available from all the different activities they've done online. And people don't often realize, I think the masses don't realize how much data is being collected on them. There's increased use of Internet of Things devices that collect personal data over multiple devices and locations, and all that can be put together and create a picture of the person that's being created. And, it's going to be really interesting as the privacy kind of space continues to develop, because we've given away a lot of data on ourselves without necessarily, like, the mass public doesn't understand how much data they've given it away. And they've given it away purely for reasons of convenience, right? Like, oh, I want the navigation system, or I want to be able to, use Alexa to turn off the lights in my, bedroom, things like that. But this all has the trade-off that this data has been collected, and it can be used to, specifically market to people, specifically even manipulate them, given what we're seeing. And compromises, as we're talking about, is, this data is being exploited against these people. There can be identified and tracked and monitored against multiple devices. And the thing is, there's so much data out there that even if they're anonymized, that data can be put together and basically de-anonymized from the different ways and actually identify individuals. We also have the issue of voice and facial recognition, going back to kind of the social issues. One, it's basically, it's a way to get around legal procedure in a way. So, we'll go with like biometrics. So think about like fingerprint biometrics. There is case law that says, like Border Patrol, government official can't force you to put your thumb down and open up the phone. Well, however, with like facial ID, they don't really have to do that, right? They just have to hold it up to your face and it can unlock in some of these situations. So it's actually an easier way to kind of get into your information that didn't exist before. So it's actually becoming easier for people to access that information without consent. You're having more prediction data that's being kind of gathered and being able to be created about, your emotions and your beliefs, and then being able to kind of manipulate all of that. And that's very interesting. And also, I think it's going to develop an interesting way because, Apple had recently announced with the iOS 14 that they were going to require opt-in for ad tracking, and Facebook was very not like, Zuckerberg was not happy about that because it cuts down on his ability to track people and create, sell ads, and so it cuts back on their revenue. But that's a potentially a good development because it creates the opportunity for people to actually understand that this data is being gathered on them and make a conscious choice about whether they do want to share that data. We also have the issue, again, that goes back to the social issues and ethic issues of profiling. We have potentially consented to characterizing of individuals with no ability to challenge those outcomes. So we can have the kind of data that's being gathered, characterizing people in different ways based on, the information that's been gathered, and then giving them access to certain rights based on that data. So it could be employment, for housing, for social services, for credit, and that's a problem. So we think of that, for example, with China's social credit system. There's also an issue a couple of years ago where facial recognition was being used as a test in an apartment building in New York, where it could be problematic, right? If there's minorities and women who live there, and given that the software, cannot identify them correctly, if they're being locked out of their, homes, or not giving equal access, that's problematic. That's discriminatory. So it's something we need to think about moving forward with all the adoption of this, particularly with these kinds of like facial recognition, as well as with if we're restricting access to certain services based on the data that's being gathered. Another issue that kind of comes into here, of course, is what's going on with Clearview AI. They have obviously scraped a lot of data on photos from the internet and from Facebook and a lot of other social media platforms. And, the government's actually been using it, for example, in the protests to kind of try to discourage people from going out there if they have maybe, some criminal history or of arrest and things like that. So it can be particularly worrisome, as it can be very used in negative ways to influence what's going on. So it's something we continue to think about, and I think that is why we're seeing in the past couple of years several cities banning this, because there is a known way that this, the facial recognition ID is unequally applied and is not properly is biased. Again, tying into all of this is that data is really the most valuable resource today, and it's like oil. And we're continuing to see monetization by companies like Facebook and all of this in this data. And so I think moving forward, it's going to be interesting to see how that continues to develop as people understand what the data actually means and how it applies to how it applies to whatever interactions they're having moving forward with the companies as well as with the government and in all these spaces. The next issue that is kind of important with all of this is liability. So this ties into who is responsible for losses and damages caused by error by an artificial intelligence. So traditionally, a human operator would be liable, but since this is self-executing machinery or code, like who's really liable for this? In the end, some person or legal entity must be liable, but there's ambiguity now in the line of causation or fault because it's not like a direct relationship now necessarily. So this can develop in different ways. We might start seeing, there might be questions about, well, to what extent is a developer or software provider liable? Is it a manufacturer liable? Is a smart device owner liable? So a way to think about this is, autonomous vehicles, right? So they're going to have some algorithm that's programmed into them, and say, it's going to be interesting because, as for example, on a manufacturer front, someone like Ford or any car company, it's going to be hard for them to say they're not going to prioritize in the algorithm the people who actually own the vehicle, right? Because how do you sell a consumer product if you tell people, oh, it might not prioritize your life over, the random person who runs into the street? So that's going to be, it can't be fair there necessarily. So that's one consideration, like how do corporate interests go into this? And additionally, how are you going to make that kind of decision making about whose, life is more valuable than another's, or decisions like that? And it's difficult. And so you need for a lot of this, both kind of social, ethical, like committees to kind of go into this, but you also create the issue of where you do have, say, an accident that happens with the autonomous vehicle. At that point, does it become, is it an issue of just the manufacturer, the car company that's at issue, since they created the product? Is it, the owner of the vehicle is going to be liable, even though they weren't, at this point, they weren't driving, so they weren't actually in control, right? It was autonomous, but they did own the vehicle. Or is it going to be whoever kind of developed the software ultimately and, was responsible for actually coding it to make those decisions? And these are things I think we'll continue to kind of see develop in court, in case law. And that's where a lot of law develops at least in the US. It's all based on the developments in court. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that kind of shakes out. And the important thing, I think one issue that's going to be interesting in that space is we really need to have justices who are knowledgeable about this, about kind of tech, or willing to be kind of knowledgeable making these decisions if we want to have a, a kind of a framework that makes sense. And part of the problem is we've recently had a lot of unqualified people appointed to federal district courts. So that creates an issue with potentially, will we actually have people who understand or are willing to learn to understand making decisions on a lot of this as it develops in the next, couple decades. So will be something to be kind of seen. And as we talked about, there's multiple considerations that come into play here. There is the company profit we talked about, as well as consumer expectations. Yeah, some interesting examples here. We talked about the autonomous vehicle. Another kind of interesting issue is that there are a couple, both in Australia and in the US last year, there were some bills that were put forward as being, basically criminalizing the spreading of controversial content on social media. And that was very, very interesting because it basically was saying, and this, was saying, if you have like violent and hateful material put on social media and your algorithm doesn't pick it up fast enough to remove it, then the tech executive who's actually in charge of the business would be facing both fines and jail time. This is kind of worrisome, to a degree, because if you're putting this all down to, say, Zuckerberg getting jail time for there being hateful content on Facebook that his AI algorithm didn't pick up fast enough, that creates a situation where he's now making decisions about free speech and is going to be overly restrictive because he doesn't want to go to jail. So this is a situation where we don't want to give all the power to the tech executives who are being driven by personal interests and corporate interests. We want the decision to at least remain with the government, who's supposed to still have some social and ethical considerations that they're supposed to be taken into effect. So I think legislators need to get a lot smarter about how they try to regulate these. Don't leave it to self-regulation, and don't try to like criminalize it and create jail time or things like that, because it creates improper incentives around what's supposed to be happen. So they need to, I think one of the issues is legislators need to get experts in this space and kind of get into these detailed discussions and start creating laws that really, laws and regulations that are very specific to the space and really help businesses operating the space stop trying to sometimes feel like they are trying to fit, a square peg into a round hole. Another kind of issue that can arise with liability that is going to be interesting kind of moving forward is there is likely going to be a lot of decision making that's been based on recommendations by algorithms. And at some point it's going to be, the question will come down, how reasonable is it to rely on the recommendation by a certain algorithm if the recommendation turns out wrong, right? Was it reasonable to, for example, as a business, make a certain decision that resulted in harm, but the algorithm had recommended that it would be a decision that was beneficial, but it just didn't end up being that way. So I think those are things we'll continue to see. One of the issues for any business that's dealing with these kind of uncertainties around liability is that you have to have the forethought to address all of these. So you need to be having these discussions, early on. You need to be thinking about all of this, and you need to be addressing all the liabilities in your, transact in your agreements in terms of service and privacy policies and agreements with your customers and vendors. All of these potential liabilities need to be thought out and appropriately addressed. So the business is set up in the strongest potential position with respect to these liabilities and arguments in favor of the business if any of these end up in court. All right, so that was the presentation. I can take some questions now.
So we have few questions in Q&A section.
Great. Let's see. So one question says, there are data leaking from big companies every year. Is there any lawsuits for those cases? There's always a lot of lawsuits over data breach cases. So data breach, unfortunately, this is one of the issues with a lot of companies. I think they, both in respect to kind of privacy and data, they don't invest enough. They also don't invest enough in cybersecurity, and that leads to issues related to data breaches. And that then leads to, what we saw with like Equifax. That was a big lawsuit, and they had like someone who was like trained in marketing as like a head of cybersecurity. It made no sense. And other companies that experienced ransomware because of this. There's even been government offices who have experienced this, where they've had their computers tied up because they don't realize even what's a phishing attack, what's a attack to kind of tie up the computers. So it's something that businesses, it's going to continue to be issues. So businesses need to start thinking about, how do we actually create a plan for one, how do we create a security, appropriate cybersecurity kind of policy and format to store our data, especially if you are AI or analytics, right? You need to, I have a lot of clients who are like SOC 2, they do those SOC 2 kind of audit and certification. So you need to do the proper things. And generally, if you're operating in this space, your customers also require it, especially if you're B2B. So it's just something you need to be investing in and doing. So both cybersecurity and proper treatment of data are very important. Is law prepared to face autonomous beings that are funded by cryptocurrencies without any participation of human beings? I'm not sure like what that question is getting at, but I think in general, I'm going to take it as, is law prepared to address kind of new innovative developments? And law always is flexible enough that it changes and innovates with the kind of what's going on. And it will continue to do that. It's always continued to develop, and it will. And there's really, the law continues to apply. Doesn't matter if you're doing an innovative thing. The law still applies. It may be gray, and it may be a little bit grayer in how you apply, but that just makes it more complicated in how you have to comply with it. It makes it a little bit more difficult for you to necessarily figure out that complication of how to comply. But that's what you got to do as a business in an emergent space. You're attorney, like I help my clients find that appropriate balance between legal risk and business interest that makes sense for every deal and every transaction they're doing, so that they can move forward in a way that they're comfortable with. And then it just says working with smart contracts. Smart contracts, I think one confusing thing what a lot of non-lawyers think is that they're actually contracts. Smart contracts are non-contracts. They're just self-executing code. So contracts are still needed to actually control those transactions that are occurring. So the smart contract is just a code. And the best way, I think, for a lot of businesses to handle this is to get the developers and their attorneys in a room together so that they can have a discussion and actually help them be able to appropriately code that smart contract. Since I work with a lot of kind of engineers and tech people with the tech background, and there are not, they don't understand how contracts really work. So it's important to have people of kind of both backgrounds in the room together. Okay, let's see. Next question. Are there any SOX or audit rules for AI process? There, again, there are these kind of accepted like cyber kind of like security standards, like the SOC 2. That's something that, businesses can consider as they grow. And those are things, for any business that's dealing with data. And AI is just an application to the data. So you should be looking at those kind of cybersecurity measures and security measures as you grow a business in the space. Let's see. Akin to patent trolls, is there a danger by applying overly restrictive AI-related lies to see an emergence of AI trolls? Well, there isn't like specific AI-related laws. I mean, that's part of the issue with tech, right? It's an emerging space. And regulators and legislators are behind the times. I mean, I'm not sure if any of you have seen ever any of the hearings on, with Facebook or Google that Congress has done. They're always, they asked, like, there was one a couple of years ago with the Google executive where they asked for, one of the, I think the Republican congressman asked him why Trump showed up when they Googled moron. And well, that's the Barbara Streisand effect. Like, now that's the only thing that shows up. So they don't even understand how the internet works. They also ask, like, Facebook, how do you make money, right? They don't understand these basic things. So there is not like, this is the AI law. It's just the laws that exist. So like contracts law applies to contracts, intellectual property law applies to the intellectual property issues, liability issues relating to like business torts, and which is how people potentially, like, let's say injury, if there's a car accident, like personal injury kind of issues or product liability issues apply. But because it's AI, it creates new complexities. So you need to be kind of working with someone who understands like the law, both the tech and the law, who can kind of help you apply that law in a way that makes sense, again, to your business, and is that right balance of, well, I'm complying with the law, I'm limiting my risk, but I'm also making it work so that my business can actually structure and grow moving forward. So that's kind of so I always tell people, because the emerging space is innovative, I have to be creative with how I, structure certain provisions in contracts for my clients and things like that. Because a lot of this, some of this may have not been done before, right? So we're structuring it as we go, and I have to be creative in that sense of helping clients find that right balance.
Hello, this is Jason. So I do have one question here. So in ideas, in our community, we have a lot of senior AI engineer, data scientists. They are working at the core technology in a lot of big companies. But recently, some of our members, they have some concern. When they change the job, for instance, from one large company to another one, from one driving cars, group to another one. They are working on the core business logic there, like a recommendation, engine, like a lot of AI technology. So, do you have any suggestions? When this type of senior AI engineer, senior data scientists, maybe technology leaders, when they change job, is there any suggestion they should take care?
Well, I mean, always read your employment contract. I mean, I work with I have clients who, are engineers, or, work in the tech space and maybe are doing a side business to their job. So again, that situation, or whether you're transitioning to a new company, or whether you're leaving to start your own kind of business, it's very, very important. Read, and this is why if you need to engage with like an attorney if you're doing any of this, because it's important to make sure you understand all of that. The agreement. I've had this issue with professor clients as well. Like, the agreements need to be read carefully. Like, what rights do you actually have with your employer? Is what you're doing is it exactly what you were doing with the employer, right? And it also depends if it's is it kind of like the same time? Is it a side business you're doing? Does that side business conflict with what you're doing right now for the employer? There's certain ways to try to handle that, and you have to be careful. If you're moving to like a new thing, like we don't want like the whole thing with Waymo and Uber, right? You should not be taking any materials with you, right? You don't want to be sued for like misappropriation of trade secrets, or taking any proprietary information. So it's a very, very I think people sometimes are not careful enough in that space. So I think it's always important to kind of seek counsel and make sure what you're doing is legal, and you're not violating any agreements or obligations you have as an employee, or as a former employee unintentionally, that opens you up to lawsuits.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your comments. So I think oh, you already have the contact information. So we are where you are the last speaker for today. Is it's our first time to manage this online conference. In the past 5 years, it's we went to USA, we go to Pasadena Convention Center. In the last 3 years, we went to Los Angeles Convention Center. So it's totally different, but it's good. So even during the lunchtime, we have about 300 attendees. So anyway, it's a wonderful day. Okay, and thank you again to give us such a wonderful presentation, and it's really helpful. And if any attendees they need help from either start your own company or do some creative job. Okay, I think this is the information you can contact with. I think email, website there. Okay, so I think that's the end for today. Thank you for all the speakers. Thank you to Harvey to host this conference. And okay, thank you for all the attendees. Okay, let's welcome to come back tomorrow. Tomorrow we will start at 10 a.m. and we have a lot of AI, data science, and technology speakers there. Okay, thank you all.